Hi and welcome back. Professor Plyman here, and today we're going to be talking about the anatomy of a persuasive argument. And specifically, we are going to be talking about your reading this week, Fatal Distraction. So, one of the things that I always think of when I think about this article, Fatal Distraction, is the idea of completely changing your mind after learning new information. If you haven't read the article yet, pause your video here, go read the article, and then come back. But I will tell you this. If you had asked me before I read this article if there was any chance that I could ever accidentally leave a child in the backseat of a car, I would have told you absolutely not. And then I read Fatal Distraction, and I had this moment while I was reading the article where I was like, oh, I understand now how this happens to people. And that knowledge, that information, that argument completely changed my mind. So let's talk about what an argument is and what it isn't. An argument is not just an opinion, it's not a fight, it's not someone yelling. When we talk about argument, especially in academia, what we're talking about is a claim that is supported with reasons and with evidence. So let's talk about the article that I had you read this week. The article, it's called Fatal Distraction. It's written by Gene Weingarten, and it was published in the Washington Post. Weingarten is a Pulitzer Prize winning writer, and the question that I really want you to think about as you study this article is, how does the author convince readers that this type of tragedy is more complicated than it first appears? So we're going to be talking about what an argument is, how arguments work, and we're going to be using Fatal Distraction as an example. So every argument has 4 parts: claim, evidence, reasoning, and audience. The claim is what you want me to believe. The evidence is, why should I believe you? The reasoning is, how do these pieces connect? And the audience is the person or people or group that you are trying to convince. Now, we're also talking about rhetorical appeals this week. If you haven't watched that video, quickly, logos is logic, ethos is credibility, and pathos is emotions. And we're going to talk about how Weingarten uses all of those in this article. So Fatal Distraction does not start with statistics. It doesn't start with definitions. It doesn't start with research. Instead, it starts with a grieving father in the courtroom. So why does Weingarten do this? He does this because good writers think about readers first. He put himself in the shoes of a reader, and immediately when we see this grieving father, we have a sense of compassion, and that sense of compassion leads us to want to understand how this happened. And that search for understanding is a great place to approach an argument, because we are primed to receive information. So I'm not going to say that you always want to start with pathos in every argument, but it works very well in this argument. It's a great hook, and we are hooked, right? We see this grieving father, we see this courtroom scene, this very emotional language and vivid imagery, and we want to know, how did this happen? Why did this happen? What's going to be the result of this? And we want to know, could this happen to me? The emotion gets you to keep reading, and the emotion here is what opens the door. Then he follows up with ethos, and Gene Weingarten pretty quickly gets us to trust him. So sometimes when we think of ethos, we think of things like, I'm a doctor and here's medical advice. And that can definitely be an example of ethos, but that's not the only example. Here we see credibility proved when the author does his homework. He interviews prosecutors and psychologists and neuroscientists, grieving parents, jurors, safety advocates. He presents all aspects of this argument fairly, and that leads us to trust him. He also handles this really difficult topic with sensitivity. He comes out and says, look, I don't know what the answer is. And that honesty creates this sense of trust in the reader. So we see that his credibility comes from the research that he's done, from his fairness with the issue, and from the fact that he has presented this from as many different perspectives as possible. So he has pathos that makes us desperate to hear the story. He has ethos that makes us trust him to tell this story. And then he brings in the logos. Here comes the evidence. He gives us statistics. The list of the type of people that this has happened to was overwhelmingly convincing because we can all see ourselves in that list. When he talks about the neuroscience and the memory research and the lizard brain and getting home without realizing what path you took, immediately, if you're a driver, you've probably experienced that. The reoccurring patterns, the expert explanations all make us see that, like, yes, this could happen to anybody. The emotion gets our attention, but it's the evidence that changes our thinking. One of the things that I want you to notice here is that instead of pathos, ethos, and logos all being separate elements, they are woven together throughout the article. They work together to create this persuasive argument. So, now what about counter arguments? A great argument doesn't ignore disagreements. Here we see really good counter argument because there is this question of who could do this and how does this happen? And he acknowledges this. He says, many people think I could never do that. And I will tell you, that was my stance the moment I picked it up the very first time. But then he does a really good job of answering that objection with the neuroscience, the expert testimony, the psychological research, and the real cases. Now, here's what I want you to notice. Counter arguments make the argument stronger, not weaker. If we don't have an opinion on something and then we read an article and now all of a sudden we do have an opinion on something, we're like, okay. But if you have an opinion on something and you figure out that maybe your opinion is incorrect or incomplete and you change your mind, that is a more powerful experience and it's something that's really going to stay with you. And that is what is possible through this article. That's what makes it such a brilliant example of how a persuasive argument works. So why is this article so convincing? Not because it uses facts, not just because it's emotional, but because it combines all three rhetorical appeals. We see emotion, we see logic, we see credibility, and he's very respectful of opposing viewpoints. If you, as a writer, can manage that, being respectful of the opposing viewpoints by using those rhetorical appeals to really convince your audience, then you are going to have a much greater possibility of changing somebody's mind. And if you wanted to convince somebody or to change their mind, how would you do that? Would you start with facts or a story or research or an expert? or personal experience? The answer is there's no right answer. It depends on your audience. It depends on the argument you're making and who you're talking to and what tools are in your toolbox. One of my goals this semester is to really get you thinking like an author, like a writer. You have all of these tools at your disposal. It's just something that you're going to want to practice. And then I'm going to leave you today with just a list of different tools that authors use. Spend some time thinking about, if you were trying to convince somebody of something, which of these tools do you think would be most effective? And the tools that I have up here are statistics, story, experts, things like witnesses. We saw that a lot in the article. Research studies, emotional examples, personal experiences. We're much more willing to listen to somebody's story if they're telling us about their own experience. Counter argument can be a very powerful tool. Analogies, historical examples, and quotations. We can use all of these tools in combination with our rhetorical appeals to really create something powerful. If you have questions about this, if you want to chat about the article, I know it's a tough read, send me an email or stop by during office hours. I'm always happy to help. Have a great week.